what we would like to deal with is a couple problem passages, problems for people who are reading along and can't make much sense out of what the Bible says. And of course, that's a problem passage is one way to think of it, but I always think that a problem passage is really hiding something of great value if you can uncover it, if you can unlock its difficulty, if you can see what the Bible is saying, you probably then will understand a lot of other passages much better. So even though it's a problem, if you can't understand it, if you continue to try and you continue to look for resolutions, and you do finally find something that's satisfactory, you really gain so much more for it. It was worth every minute of the time it took to do it. So that's the spirit of it. And I'll just briefly, before we get into what we have prepared, just wanted to get you to turn to that Psalm 51 and just illustrate the point that we're trying to make about this. Psalm 51, verse 5. I'm not at all trying to give you an exposition of Psalm 51. Some of you may very well see that the answer is in expounding the whole of it. I don't have a problem with the whole of it. I had a problem with verse 5, because it said, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." And since David is talking about a sin, and he's talking about a sin which everyone gets to know by the fact that the Bible speaks about it, and by the fact that the Bible has spoken about it, everybody has read the Bible, knows about it, there would be hundreds of millions of people knew about this sin. So to understand what he means when he says this in verse 5 is to think about what he meant by his mother. What mother is he referring to? Is he referring to his literal mother? Is he referring to an ancestor, maybe going back to Eve? What does he mean when he says, "I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me"? Now there's a companion passage which is only companion in the sense that it has similarities. It's not really a companion passage in the sense that one gives you the answer to the other, but if you were to turn to the Gospel record of John, chapter 8, you find something similar in that Jesus said to the people that he was talking to at this particular time, for the very awkwardness that they were presenting to him in his exposition, he said in verse 44, "You are of your father, the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar, and the father of it." So the passage in Psalm presents who is the mother. The passage in John presents who is the father. Like, who is he speaking of? Would they have understood who he was speaking of? And how certain can we be of our resolution of these matters? So that's the areas that my mind was working on and trying to resolve these, so that I have a better understanding of the whole setting because of this. So we just go through the psalm, and then we can maybe put some sense to the verse. So it is a psalm of David, and we're given in the title that it was when Nathan the prophet came to him after he'd gone into Bathsheba. So we don't want to go into all that record, because we assume that most of us, if not all of us, understand that. But what David said is really quite important. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. According to the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee, thee only have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mightest be justified when thou speakest, and be clear when thou judgest. Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, thou desirest truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part thou shalt make me to know wisdom. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me to hear joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Hide thy face from my sins. Blot out all mine iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence. Take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit. Then will I teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners shall be converted unto thee. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God, thou God of my salvation, and my tongue shall sing aloud of thy righteousness. O Lord, open thou my lips, and my mouth shall show forth thy praise. For thou desirest not sacrifice, else would I give it. Thou delightest not in burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. O God, thou wilt not despise. Do good in thy good pleasure unto Zion. Build thou the walls of Jerusalem. Then shalt thou be pleased with the sacrifices of righteousness, with burnt offering and with whole burnt offering. Then shall they offer bullocks upon thine altar. Now, by just reading the psalm and getting just some of the basic language in our minds, it would seem that David intended that people should read this to learn how to deal with sin like he had committed. Because there was no sacrifice that he could offer, he must have felt, and maybe for a good deal of time, was really wrenched in what he would do about this when it came to his mind in its fullest sense. It's interesting. It doesn't take long for one to come to their mind in an act like he had committed. If you think of Amnon, it was probably moments after he had committed his sin that he came to see, and probably very clearly, how foolish he had been. But David wrestled with this, it looks like, for about 9 months. And if the judgment that Nathan spoke to him about, that the child would die, meant that when he actually had the words of Nathan to listen to, the child was born, then yes, it was that long. Which David talked about, my bones are just sort of just agonizing because of the heavy hand of God upon me. And that must have been through his mind, through the lack of peace that he had and the lack of ability to see how to deal with this. But having got that far, then he was prepared to cooperate, obviously, with God in inspiration to write this. So every part of it must be very instructive, and that's why, looking at verse 5, it was so meaningful to me to find an answer to that. What did he mean? So just go through them. I'm sorry I didn't advance those slides if you're following along. In Psalm 51, then, the verse, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me," is the key verse. And I've just put a little modification of the title there, David's mother, or Eve. In other words, going back right to Eve. What was he actually referring to? And that's when we would look at every other part of Scripture we could to try to find a suitable answer to that. And there weren't, to my mind, when I was looking through it, a whole lot to work on. But this was one of the ones that came out of the text to me and had something to say, because this comment in Genesis 3 verse 20 seemed to me to be either out of order or illustrating something that doesn't necessarily just follow. Like, why would he, when God talked about the judgments upon Adam in verse 19 to say, in the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, and dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. And then, the immediate next verse seems to be not a flowing on from that, but it does tell us, further facts about it. Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living, which was a different name than he had called her when he recognized that she was bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. So he's trying to illustrate that Eve would be the mother of all living. Now, she's obviously not the mother of animals, so he's referring, you would assume, in this, unless someone sees it to be more than that. He's talking about all the people that would come from her, all of her children. Unto Adam and also to his wife did Yahweh God make coats of skins and clothe them. So I always saw that was to be significant, but never could quite figure out just why that verse was there in that location and what the true significance of it was. We know this verse. This verse is talked about a lot more than other verses. In Genesis 3, verse 15, in the conversation that God had with the serpent, just connecting it to verse 14, Yahweh God said unto the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. And of course, it's not just Christadelphians, but people who have read the Bible and looked at that have seen that was a prophecy about an enmity between thee and the woman, between her seed and the serpent's seed. Now that would be a bit of a stretch if we really thought that that was to be literally taken, that there was going to be some later serpent, literally, a descendant of that serpent, that was going to be the one that would be in conflict with the descendant of the woman and that particular descendant. So I think any one of us that reads it would sort of tuck that away as well as a significant part of the prophecy and of the story, but not specific enough that we can just immediately see what it means. So we continue. And there's a number of things that stand out. So if you go to 1 John chapter 3, there's this comment about Cain, which is hard to put into place, but it obviously fits there somewhere, because in verse 11 it says, this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of that wicked one, and slew his brother. And wherefore slew he him? Because his own works were evil, and his brother's righteous. Well, quite apart from what other is said in verse 12, the bolded part stands out, that he was of the wicked one. So who was the wicked one? Was the wicked one Adam? I mean, our minds would be naturally directed to Adam. He was his father. Or was it something else? And of course, if you start reading commentaries, like some of the commentaries that other Christian groups have said or stated what they believed about it, you get all kinds of weird things that relate to their beliefs. So that didn't help. But Brother Thomas has stated it in Help Us Israel. And even though you have to, there's a bit of a stretch in Brother Thomas's exposition, you have to agree with him, because it's not as if he's pointing out something where the answer is obvious, but he does suggest something which I believe is a satisfactory answer. And I just wanted to go through what he says here, and we'll take it. There's 3 slides relating to this, and I've just made it 3 slides so we can get font big enough you can all see. So he says, as I have remarked before, sin is personified by Paul as preeminently a sinner, and by another apostle as the wicked one, and slew his brother. There is precision in this language, which is not to be disregarded in the interpretation. Cain was of the wicked one. That is, he was a son of sin, of the serpent sin, or original transgression. The Mosaic narrative of facts is interrupted at the end of the 6th verse of the 3rd chapter. Now, you might just turn there because you need to see this so you can see exactly what he's saying. So that's Genesis chapter 3 at verse 6, which reads, "When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat." And then he says, it's interrupted there. The fact passed over there, though implied in the 7th verse, is plainly stated in the 1st verse of the 4th chapter. Well, what's implied in the 7th verse? "The eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons." Now, it's clearly stated, he says, in the 1st verse of the 4th chapter, which is, "Adam knew Eve, his wife. She conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from Yahweh." I must say that although I've read Elpis Israel more than once, I never really had paid enough attention to what he was saying here to go and see whether that really was the way I would have read it if I had tried to connect those things. And I must say I had to think a lot about what Thomas was saying to see, but when I went on and what he had to say, it became more convincing. So he says, these texts conjoined, read this. In other words, if you join verse 6 of 3 to verse 1 of chapter 4, "And Eve gave unto her husband, and he did eat with her. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew they were naked." So he's saying that this conception took place immediately after they partook of the fruit. And then God speaks to them. Then they make clothing to cover their nakedness, etc. "The eyes of them both were opened, they knew that they were naked." Now here was a conception in sin, the originator of which was the serpent. "When therefore in the set time afterwards Eve bare Cain, though procreated by Adam, he was of the serpent, seeing that he suggested the transgression which ended in the conception of Cain. In this way sin in the flesh being put for the serpent, Cain was of that wicked one, the preeminent sinner, and the firstborn of the serpent's seed." I don't know if I could have got that out of that myself. Having read it a number of times, it was really this exposition of John Thomas that put that together, and then looking at some of these other passages, starting to see much more sense than I could any other way. That in the conception occurred at the particular time just after they partook of the fruit. So he says it's as if the procreation was obviously performed by Adam, but he was the son of the serpent because he suggested the transgression which ended in the conception of Cain. So we're looking at a father and we're looking at a mother, which are used in an unusual sense in other parts of the Bible, but that's where we got their beginning. In this way, now the bolding there is mine, not John Thomas. You don't see that in Elpis Israel. In this way, sin in the flesh, that expression, sin in the flesh, only used once in the scriptures, but he's using it, I'm not sure he's necessarily thinking of the place where it is used in the scripture, but using it for the fact that we now have inherited something from Adam and Eve, being put for the serpent. Cain was of that wicked one, the preeminent sinner, and the firstborn of the serpent's seed. Now that blending of figurative things with natural things has always been very confusing in the Bible. But it is so important to be able to sort it out that, our approach to would be that we would say, look, this has got to be natural unless it cannot be natural. Well, it couldn't be natural. The father of Cain was Adam. But in a figurative sense, the father of Cain was the serpent. That's what he's saying. For people who are used to looking at figures in the Bible and thinking figuratively, that is a really enlightening way to think of it. But it would not occur unless we were having problems with, say, John 8. We couldn't really make sense of what was said in 1 John chapter 3. So we come back to this explanation. Now he goes on, and this is where it becomes, I think, more convincing as well. So he says, every son of Adam is conceived in sin and shapen in iniquity. That's Psalm 51, verse 5. See, every son, so it's not just Cain. Every son of Adam is conceived in sin and shapen in iniquity, and therefore sinful flesh, on the principle that what is born of the flesh is flesh, if he obeys the impulses of his flesh, he is like Cain, of the wicked one. But if he believe the exceeding great and precious promises of God, obey the law of faith, put to death the unlawful obedience to his propensities, he becomes a son of the living God, and a brother and a joint heir of the Lord Jesus Christ, of the glory to be revealed in the last time. Now that's a huge and very important thing to understand of how what we're looking at as the descendants of the serpent is not little serpents. Although I'll look at a verse in a minute and you'll have to decide whether you to just reconsider that. We see it in a figurative sense, as he says, if he obeys the impulses of the flesh, he is like Cain, of the wicked one. And that's the important thing, and that is an answer to Psalm 51, verse 5. And a far better answer that I was ever able to come up with by searching without knowing that connection or that exposition. So let me just go through a couple other things that make maybe even a little more sense now when you think of it that way. So in Numbers 21, we know we have this incident in Israel's history where it says, the people spake against God, against Moses, wherefore have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, there's no water, and our soul loatheth this light bread. All of the bolding rather is mine. And Yahweh sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. Now it's this reoccurrence of serpents. Obviously this was not just an isolated thing. They just happened to be going through the wilderness and run into serpents. No, it says Yahweh sent the serpents among the people. God was going to teach the people something. And in verse 8, Yahweh said unto Moses, when the people appealed to God, and I mean there's a lot of wonderful things about this to illustrate a bigger picture that fits other passages. But just quickly in the points we need to make here to connect where we're going, Yahweh said unto Moses, make thee a fiery serpent, set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, put it on a pole, and it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. Now there's, I don't know if we can exhaust all of the things that we can learn from that episode. It's only got a few verses. It's pretty well all that the Bible has to say about it, except a comment or two in the New Testament. But it's a serpent. And it was biting people, and they were dying. And the people that were being bitten were the people that were complaining about God's way, and were very weak in spirit because they couldn't deal with the hunger and the thirst they had, and they were prepared to say, as far as the men are concerned, our soul loatheth this light bread. In other words, they despised what God had provided and was able to keep the whole nation alive for 40 years. Just imagine if we only had one thing we ate every day, every meal over here. There would be probably a few complaints even here about that. But no, it kept everybody alive and everybody healthy. But this serpent of brass, I often wonder what you think about this. You know how you may have a medical alert bracelet. You may be wearing it. And if you do, you might notice that there would be a serpent wound around a pole. And that's been taken up for centuries of time as some way of healing. I guess it was probably somebody made it up, maybe even knowing this experience, and commented on it. But one of the things that I find faulty with anything I've seen as a representation or a picture that people have of a serpent on a pole is the serpent's always alive, always looking alive. Now that doesn't fit what we're learning about a serpent and what we're supposed to do with the serpent. It would seem to me that, I can't prove this, and it's just my own feelings about it, that if there was a serpent on a pole that was lifted up that people could look on and they could learn something about it, it would be a serpent with its head pierced. It would be attached to that post with a nail through its head. The serpent has to be dead for people to live. You know, it's interesting that he didn't tell him to take one of those serpents, kill it, and put it on a pole. He said to make it a serpent of brass. So you have to go to something else even before this to see why it would be made of brass, because brass is a symbol of rebellious human nature. So in Numbers 16, verse 38, the censors of these sinners against their own souls, let them make them broad plates for a covering of the altar. For they offered them before Yahweh. Therefore they are hallowed. They shall be a sign unto the children of Israel. And Eleazar the priest took the brazen censers wherewith they were burnt, had offered, and they were made broad plates for a covering of the altar. But they were a symbol of this attitude that people had of standing up against God. And it would seem to me that when the serpent was made out of brass, that people would have understood what it meant, that they had to put to death what it was that was killing them. And what was killing them wasn't really the serpents, it was what those serpents represented, going right back as far as that first serpent that's mentioned. I just find it's fascinating that you meet this again and again in the scriptures. So in Matthew 12, I think there's 3 times that we find this in Matthew, where he speaks of the people of his generation as a generation of vipers. How can you, being evil, speak good things? Now, it is really kind of significant, isn't it, that the people that were of the generation that was going to put him to death were addressed as a generation of vipers. Anybody who knew their Bibles, going back to the promise that was made in Genesis 3, you would think would have made a connection with this. There was supposed to be a seed of the serpent, and there was supposed to be a seed of the woman. If they were thinking of literal serpents, they wouldn't get anywhere with it. But if they thought of the serpents representing rebellious human nature and what Jesus was saying about the generation they lived at, they could make a perfect connection with it. It was people that were in the line of Cain that were born of that evil one, which we know was the words of the serpent, or the serpent, and what he had to say and his advice he had to offer to Eve. So there's a number of connections which make a lot more sense when you see what Brother Thomas was making of that record. So, see, here's the passage that we looked up and started with. So he says in John 8, verse 43, why do you not understand my speech, even because you cannot hear my word? You are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there's no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. Now, it's very important that we understand that the serpent was a liar. Not all expositions of what happened in Genesis make the serpent a liar. If you've ever heard of an exposition that says that what really the Adam and Eve believed was that Adam and Eve should have died the very day in which they sinned, that exposition does not make the serpent a liar. That makes God the liar. Because they didn't die that day. The serpent would be right. So the only understanding that really matches what is being said here and is consistent with the record is that being the father of the devil, they were the father of this serpent in a figurative sense. He was a murderer from the beginning, because look at the people that have died because of what he said and his advice. He abode not in the truth. Why? Because there's no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own. He's a liar and the father of it. A very, very good symbol for everybody who follows that as a way of life. But it's got to be understood in the figurative sense. And you can see, brothers and sisters, that that's what we have got to do. We've got to see, even though it's difficult to see, and it's a stretch for our understanding, initially maybe, later on it's very consistent with our understanding to see that figurative language explains this far better than a literal language. So when we get into the problem that all of us have, you can see how you can say consistently that our mother did conceive us in sin, because we all have a carnal mind. We've all got that mind. The carnal mind is hostile to God. It can't be subject to the law of God, because there's no way you can make it that way. The only way we can deal with it is to put it to death, destroy it. But we can't convert it. It can't be made subject to the law of the law of God. And it is interesting that when you look at Cain and his life, it seems to be that that's the kind of child he was. You don't see good things about Cain. But you see a lot of others who seem to have followed Cain, and therefore would be other descendants of the serpent in a figurative sense. I think that's a very important idea, so that in the atonement, in the understanding of what we're dealing with, the body and the proneness we have to sin, is to get that right is really essential in understanding all the other aspects of it. So I would just say that in exposition of Psalm 51 verse 5, when it says, "Against thee only have I sinned and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mayest be justified when thou speakest, and be clear when thou judgest. Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive thee." That he was not speaking about his mother. It wasn't a condemnation of his actual literal mother, but he was acknowledging something that maybe there were very few other people that ever acknowledged, that maybe he never heard anybody else explain it that way. But with God's Spirit upon him, he was saying things that the hundreds of millions of people that have read this whole record, if they put the time and effort into it, would understand a whole lot more, because of verses like verse 5, "In sin did my mother conceive me."